Hi, I'm Suzy Birstein, and I'm so happy that you're joining me for my artist talk this evening about my current solo exhibit at PoMoArts called When I Have Wings to Fly. If you want to come with me, fly through, come on. This piece is called This Is How Life Is. And it's one of my first Frida pieces for this show, and she's painted very blue. I actually thought I'd be very monochromatic in this show, and each piece would have a color that was symbolic of the piece. So this one stayed blue. It is representative of blue as spirituality, but also blue as in having the blues sometimes. And it is after a painting of hers that I love called Broken Column, which has a kind of an ancient Greek column as her spine, and it's broken and bleeding. And in my piece, I gave her that same column, but then I extended it. I often do headdresses, and I extended it into a kind of more pristine column that's actually a vertebrae from a Mexican folk art piece. And this figure here is taken from one of Frida's drawings in her journal that's called I Am Disintegration, which is so sad. And but in my piece, even though she has this kind of broken leg that is actually coming from a broken deer's leg that I had, she's more like she's dancing on top of a healthy column. And that's more the way I wanted to see her. This piece is sitting on top of a book, and the book is a catalog from a show at the Victoria Albright Museum that was about Frida and the uncovering of her artifacts, like her clothing and her makeup and the things that she needed to make her body work and function. And it's called Frida Kahlo, Making Herself Up, which is such an interesting title for a show, and so interesting in terms of talking about makeup. So part of this piece, I have put this lipstick, which was actually my mother's lipstick, and it's Revlon lipstick, which is actually the same lipstick brand as Frida Kahlo wore, as I found out when reading this book. And I took my mother's color off, and I made a ceramic red lipstick in the color that Frida would wear. And it's the beginning of my realizing with this show that there were, I wouldn't want to say exactly gaps in my creation or my ideas, but there was an evolution that happened with my ideas and why I was making Frida. And it started to come together that this show of Frida had to do also with an honoring of my mother, and of how Frida, who is someone who we know suffered terribly from polio as a child, and later from a terrible trolley accident that speared right through her pelvic area and broke her back and caused her physical pain and many operations over the years. She still managed somehow with her resilience, her talent, her drive, her creativity to make art, to turn it into something of beauty. And she also turned her whole life into something of beauty and herself as something of beauty. It made me reflect upon my mother, who had other kinds of issues in her life and she found so difficult to turn into a life of beauty. But sometimes she did, and one way was her lipstick. This piece is called With Wings to Fly, and birds to me are a very symbolic kind of thing. My Hebrew name is Zipporah, and that means bird. And I think of birds as freedom and flight and travel and escape and flights of fancy. And then during COVID, birds became another thing. Birds became something where you're nesting and you're you're home and you're thinking about all the things that have transpired in your life, that when you were out there flying and now you're bringing them home and you're nurturing. And in this piece with Frida, who also loved birds, she had a wonderful painting with 4 parrots. So it's referencing the 4 parrots. So I have 4 different birds on this piece, but in my piece, the birds start to become her body. They're like her arms, they're like her flight, but it's not like the wings, it's like the birds themselves are like her shoulders and into flight. And yet in that, she's very contemplative, and there's a kind of sadness in there, but she's surrounding herself with roses. And again, this referenced my mother. And I saw my mother's Royal Doulton piece, and I thought that would just be a beautiful thing to have in her headdress, and kind of can join my feelings towards it together. Upon a bed of blue roses, we embrace. This piece actually started out a while back as a Madonna piece, and I couldn't come up with the baby that I wanted to have for her. She's been sitting in my studio, and there's a painting by Frida, and it's called The Love Embrace of the Universe, the Earth, brackets Mexico, Diego, me, and Senor Xotl from 1949. And basically, it shows that. It shows the universe, it shows the earth, it's got nature, and there's a woman embracing Frida, and then there's Frida, and Frida is embracing Diego, and Diego is like a baby with a Diego grown-up face. And when you read Frida's diaries, she refers to him as my child, my husband, my lover, my this, my that, right? He's like everything to her. And I thought, well, this is the piece that I would use to express that Frida piece. And so, like, nestled on her breast, we've got Frida holding Diego, and it is all about embrace and love of nature and love of the universe, and making the world a better place and appreciating where we are. This blue tree at the top is just sort of symbolic again of like spirituality and coming out of the head, but it's got gold, and again it's just kind of regal and mystical and beautiful, and represents the universe. This piece is called Armored Amour. I would say that this one is the one that kind of looks the most like Frida Kahlo to me, and I made it while I was reading her journal. And I love how Frida dresses, and I also love to dress up, and Frida always played dress up, and I'll use that word play because it's a playful act. As well as a sort of symbolic act. And in this piece, I have Frida basically wearing pages of her journal. So I just kind of was inspired by images that were in her journal, and I used that to paint the dress. And I also took a quote from the journal, which is, "I hand you my universe, and you live in me." And that, of course, is dedicated to Diego and her great love for Diego. This is another part where there's a connection between Frida Kahlo, myself, and my mother, and it's actually through the act of writing and through journaling. So my mother, she was a journalist, and I have always kept a journal since I've been about 10 years old. Frida Kahlo wrote a journal in the last 10 years of her life, and what it made me think about is the choices that we make or that we don't know we can make. And in the case of Frida, she was in that terrible accident which prevented her from having children. And this was a huge thing because she really wanted to have Diego's babies. And she did follow an incredible life of art and had an incredible life. My mother was a journalist in the late 40s, and when the men came back from the war, women were not to be having those jobs, and so men got her job. And it kind of coordinated with falling in love with my father and thinking that she had to make a choice between pursuing a career or being a parent and having a family life. So she chose that. And I think the thing that's really incredible and wonderful about the time that I'm born in And something that my mother actually would say to me is I had a choice to have both. And that's a real blessing. So the piece is titled Armored Amour, and I think of that title for a number of my pieces. And I kind of think about it for myself. And what that is that you have a spirit and a feeling of love, amour, inside of you, and you need to protect that. And there's a certain sense of armor that protects that. Some people protect that by toughening their skin and getting harder. But other people, I think myself, I think Frida, I think my mother, have a sort of protective skin that is about having fun, playing dress up. That's what it's about. So in this piece, and projecting that kind of fun, actually, projecting that. And in this piece, I have taken parts of Frida's journal and played around with them. And so she's actually dressed in her journal. She's dressed in her drawings on her clothing. Something I would like to say as a thank you to the curator, Janice Cotter, is that I brought in the books, but she made the selections. And this yellow book with the yellow in her dress, and the title, Self-Portrait in a Velvet Dress, which is all about Frida's wardrobe, completely suits Armored Amour. The music of the universe surrounds us, and this piece is after a painting that Frida did called Self-Portrait with Braid. So she has, in that painting, her hair is tangled and it's kind of flying about, and there's butterflies on her shoulder, and there's some birds, and there's sort of some flowers, but there's like a sort of like a frantic sort of sense to the original painting. In my piece, I have created these spiky sort of butterflies in black metal. And upon her head, in her headdress, is a Day of the Dead skeleton who's playing the harp. And he's got the same butterflies in his head as she has on her body. And the thing about the Day of the Dead, and I've always loved this about Mexico since my first trip to Mexico and learning about Frida, is that it is about making friends with death. It's about acknowledging death. And it has a real sense of humor to it, which Frida also had. And it's something that's really different than what we have in our culture. In this piece, Frida is wearing a hamsa earring in his hand, which I just happen to have. And Frida has it in her painting. It was a white hamsa, handmade by Picasso, an earring for her that he gave to her. The hamsa is a symbol of protection and spirituality. And I think, Frida to me is what I call a spirit mentor. And actually so is Picasso. And this is a moment where the two of them, they're not really but my two spirit mentors are in harmony with each other. And this piece just kind of talks about that in a subtle way. This piece is actually, I know I shouldn't say this in this, but it is actually one of my favorite pieces. Excuse me. And it's called Outside Time, the Magic. It refers to Frida's painting, The Wounded Deer, also one of my favorite paintings. But this piece is constructed with clay, and it was a face that actually related more to my travels to Greece and to Mexico, that kind of a classic Greek face when it was white and just at the beginning of making it. The deer in this piece is a paper mache piece. It's a folk art piece from Mexico and actually from Coyoacan. It's from a time that I went to Coyoacan about 20 years ago with a wonderful dancer. It was a very creative experience. And I was at Frida Kahlo's house once again. There was a fellow across the street, and he was an artist, and he created a number of these paper mache folk art pieces, which I bought a table of them. Many of them broke over the years. It reminded me of Frida's deer piece and of her head, that was her own face, that she puts on top of that deer. And so I made a sort of Frida face, and I took the deer face and I'm using it as an amulet around her neck. Frida loved her animals. She loved wild animals that I guess would kind of tame around her. She was kind of like a tamed wild animal herself. How I structured this piece is that in the original painting, there are arrows in the deer's body, and from the arrows there's blood. You have a real sense of Frida's pain. But Frida also transcended that pain, as we all hope to be able to do. And in my piece, this head is attached with nails. The nails are actually a structure in the neck, in the back of the piece, and form a sort of collar around the deer's face, which makes it an entirely different kind of piece. As with Frida's painting, I replaced the deer's head with her own for the headdress of this sculpture. However, rather than the nails piercing the deer's body that signifies her suffering, they reinforce the ceramic head to the papier-mâché body, emphasizing Frida's strength. I mirror this relationship by having Frida wear one of my repurposed deer heads as an amulet. Frida had pet deer in her life, and to her they symbolize herself as simultaneously wounded and empowered to express her deepest, most authentic self. Hence, I'm going with myself. As a reference to my medium, the deer on the front of Frida's dress has kiln cones in place of arrows. Kiln cones are used by ceramic artists to indicate the temperature of the kiln and to automatically shut off the kiln. So they have a kind of power. The golden paintbrush is in place of her arm. This is a symbol for me of the disintegration of Frida's body throughout her life, but the regrowth of it through her art. This piece is called Taming the Wild, Nestled to a Rose. Frida herself was pretty wild, and she was nestled to a rose. In this case, it's from this beautiful painting, one of my favorite paintings, of Frida with a necklace of thorns and a hummingbird, and there's blood around her neck. And on one shoulder is a cat, and on the other shoulder is her monkey, both of which were pets of hers, along with deer and parrots and other wonderful animals, wild animals from nature. So I've repositioned those animals, and instead of having thorns in her neck and the hummingbird, I have a bird on the top of her head that's ready for flight, or it's nesting on her head. It's definitely a content kind of a bird. On her shoulder is her monkey. This is my version of Frida's monkey, and the monkey is dressed very similarly to Frida. It's kind of like, it's not like a monkey that used to get dressed up in the old days with the organ grinders, but it's like they're companion spirits, and he's almost like her child. And the cat that she has, and I do have cats, but the cat that she has turned into a sphinx. So it's the sphinx that's nestled into the rose. And for me, the sphinx is a symbol of protection and love and wisdom and the power of the feminine spirit. With all these pets, these wild kinds of animals that were somewhat domesticated, I think that they became like Frida's children and the children that she was unable to have. So the piece kind of represents taming the wild, and Frida, of course, is an example of this. This piece is called Mi Diego, ya no estoy sola, which means, my Diego, I am no longer alone. And it's a quote in her journal. It's the actual piece is after a painting of Frida's that's called Diego in My Thoughts, where she has Diego painted into her forehead. There's tears on her cheeks, and she's dressed as a Teowana. The crown of thorns on her head, the tears on her cheeks, Diego embedded in her forehead, reference a time of infidelity, infinite love, self-sacrifice, and spirituality. In the good times, Frida dressed and painted herself as a Teowana, which pleased Diego. It also pleased her, as Teowanas are an icon or iconic of an ancient Mexican matriarchal society, and wearing this magnificent clothing would have been very empowering. The back of the sculpture is inspired by Frida's drawings and writings in her journal, where she merges herself and Diego as one, even when they're torn apart. The journal, in my opinion, is in fact one long love poem to Diego, and hence the title, Mi Diego, ya no estoy sola, my Diego, I am no longer alone. This piece is called She Was Like a Walking Flower, centered by a rod of steel. And Frida was like a walking flower. Her hair was always strewn with flowers. Her embroidery on her clothing had flowers. She had a beautiful garden with flowers, flowers in the house. The rod of steel references her broken spine, but spiritually and kind of physically and how she got through life, it was like a rod of steel. In fact, she did have steel in her body. And I actually thought of that quote because it is referencing something that someone has said about me, about how I might look really cute, etc. But actually, I am like a rod of steel, like, you know, there's that strength and empowerment and I guess intelligence that goes beyond what the physical might look like. And at the top of this rod of steel, there is a bird, which we all know what I think about birds, but that bird is carrying a pillbox, and that pillbox is actually my mother's pillbox. And in Frida's possessions that were found and shown in the museum called for the show Making Myself Up, she had a similar kind of pillbox, and I just thought that was the most amazing kind of thing. So in 2018, the Victoria and Albert Museum curated an exhibit titled Frida Kahlo, Making Herself Up, displaying an intimate collection of Frida's clothing, jewelry, makeup, and prosthetics. Diego Rivera, her husband, as we know, an artist, had specified that this treasure trove of objects not be opened until 50 years after Frida's death. Nicholas Murray's photographs of Frida Kahlo solidify her image at the height of her career and act as an entry point into the objects of her home and her studio and her career. Seeing Frida's treasured things, similar to those my mother left me, led me to incorporate my mother's treasures into my sculptures. In this piece, Once Upon a Treble Clef, on the top of that treble clef rests my mother's La Vie est Belle perfume bottle. The metal rod or treble clef represents the brace that supports Frida's broken spine due to her trolley accident. Mr. Schotel, Frida's hairless dog, nestles within her braids with her paintbrush. Her dog signifies Frida's love for companionship with animals to ease her despair at not being able to bear children. I've always identified with Frida and how she uses personal and artistic endeavors to transcend her pain into beauty. I've included in this show pieces from the Sephora series. Sephora series are self-portraits, loosely self-portraits of myself, and Sephora means bird. In this case, To Sail Like a Swan, she has a swan on her head that is referencing Salvador Dali's swans in his paintings and also his taxidermy swans that he had in his home. And she has, as do all these pieces because they happened during COVID, she is pregnant with life. And to me, during COVID, it was about nesting and it was about creating symbols of beauty, and a pregnant body was something that is so beautiful. Then I made paintings that are portraits of face portraits, such as the one over here that's called Apsara Mirage. How this piece is two different Sephora pieces. It's this one, To Sail Like a Swan, and it's another one that is a sunflower piece that's after Van Gogh, that one over there. And what is personal to me about this painting and makes it a self-portrait kind of piece is that this piece on the right-hand side with the swan in your head and this pregnant belly, this is actually my grandson in utero. That when I made this piece and started this series, I did not know that my son's wife was having a baby, and somehow this is what I was creating sculptures of. And she's got, and this baby is born in Cambodia. It's the eastern part of the world. But on her head is this Western image from Dali of the swan. The piece on the left actually represents my other daughter-in-law, and she has on her head a sort of temple-like piece that's sort of like Southeast Asian temples, and this kind of, exotic animal on her head. So in fact, what they have done is taken on East, West, and combined those kinds of cultures together in this new family. And that is part of a portrait of my life. There are a number of paintings in this show that reference the Sephora series, but they also reference Frida, and that's why they're in this show. The show of Frida, there are images of Frida, but underlying that is her love for Diego. And in my show of Sephora, there's images of women, but underlying it is also my relationship with my family and my husband. And this particular painting, which is called Till There Was You, it's after Egon Schiele's painting. And he looks like a groom, right? He even has a piece of glass for his wedding ring. And he looks a lot like my husband when we got married. I want to thank you so much for coming to see my show, When I Have Wings to Fly. I hope you enjoy the work, the talk, the readings, and thank you.